Chapter 1. The second time Elizabeth Bennet met Mr. Darcy, as they walked the grove at Rosings Park, she asked the question she'd been pondering for some time. At the Netherfield ball, Mr. Darcy stated that Lieutenant Wickham is blessed with such happy manners as may ensure his making friends. Whether he may be equally capable of retaining them is less certain. She had seen some evidence of this in the months since the Netherfield party departed, and hoped he would answer her questions. Taking a deep breath to recall her mind to the present, she slowed and turned slightly so she might face the quiet man beside her, her arm still resting lightly on his elbow, and began to ask in a halting fashion, "Mr. Darcy, I wondered if I might ask you about something you said to me at the ball at Netherfield." He hesitated briefly, easily recalling their conversation during their dance, before responding quietly, "I would be happy to answer any questions you have, Miss Bennet," he finally said, his voice betraying his tension. "It is about Mr. Wickham," she began. The muscles under her hand flexed and tightened, and she saw his jaw clench out of the corner of her eye. "I have been considering what you said about him making but not keeping friends since the night of the ball at Netherfield. Some of the officers he was initially friendly with are now hostile and distant toward him. I've also heard that many of the shopkeepers in Meryton are refusing him credit." She paused before continuing, somewhat reluctantly. "And although he swore he would never discredit you because of his affection for your father, he openly shared his story of the denied living after you departed, and the entire town is now aware of it." Her voice trailed off, uncertain of how to continue, aware she had likely said too much. She had watched him as she spoke, and his eyes revealed his obvious pain. While the mere mention of that scoundrel's name was sufficient to make him clench his jaw, suppressing the oath that threatened to escape, Darcy resolved not to provoke her ire as he had during the ball. He tenderly squeezed the hand resting on his arm, before releasing it and cautiously stepping back, taking a few moments to regain his composure through a series of measured breaths. He returned to Elizabeth and said, "I do not know precisely what Mr. Wickham said to you, but at one time he was close to my family. We played together at Pemberley as boys. My father thought highly of him, but I am afraid he did not develop into a good man. Among his other vices, he regularly runs up debts he has no intention of paying. I regret I did not warn the shopkeepers in Meryton. However, I hesitated to speak ill of him then." He sighed deeply and rubbed his hand across his face before continuing. "In Meryton he endeavoured to undermine my reputation by weaving partial truths into his narratives. It is conceivable that he could inflict significant damage upon those entrusted to my care by employing a similar strategy of telling additional half-truths." As Elizabeth had done earlier, he took a deep breath and paused to consider his words. "Miss Bennet, I would like to tell you my whole history with Wickham, and then you may judge his character. But I must beg your discretion in these matters, as they could injure more than myself." She nodded, looking him in the eye. "You may be assured of my discretion, sir," she replied. "However, do not feel you must tell me anything that causes you pain." He smiled and covered her hand on his arm as they resumed their walk. "Since you mentioned a denied living, I assume he has shared some of our history with you," Darcy began. "The senior Mr. Wickham was an excellent man, and was my father's steward for some years. When the elder Wickham asked my father to stand as godfather to his son, he agreed, and promised to sponsor the child in school. My father intended for his godson to become a rector, and left him a living conditionally in his will. However, at school it became obvious, at least to me, that Wickham's behaviour was unsuitable for a clergyman. When my father died, my former friend had not yet taken orders, a requirement for the position, and when he came to claim his inheritance, he declared he had no intention of ever doing so. Instead, he asked for £3,000, claiming he intended to study the law. He signed a document giving up any claim to the living, and I paid him the £3,000, in addition to the legacy of £1,000 my father left him outright. When the incumbent passed away several years later, he wrote to ask for the living, and it was then that I refused him. I suppose the money I gave him earlier was gone, and he now needed more. Following my refusal, he swore revenge on me, but I ignored it, believing it to be an idle threat.